I'm Tony Damian, co-chair of the Herbert Smith Freehills Global Bank Sector Group, and today I'm joined by John O'Sullivan, Director of AMP Limited, and we're here to talk about culture. Joss, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tony.
Joss, what is culture and how important is it to an organisation?
Well, Tony, it's very important and it does exist, but it's very hard to define. It's like an elephant. It's hard to define, but you know one when you see one. I quite like the description of culture, the loose description of culture as the policies, practices and behaviours that lead to the way things are done around here. That's as good a description as I think I've heard.
And how important do you think culture is to an organisation?
Well, as we've seen in the Royal Commission and elsewhere, it is important and it does have an impact on the way people behave. If there's a culture of lack of compliance, for example, that can contribute to some of the problems we've seen in some organisations. So it is definitely a driver of behaviour.
And from a director's perspective, how do you see the board's role in helping to set the culture for an organisation?
Well, the board's role is obviously very important. It's absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. So the board sets the tone from the top. The board approves the key policies and procedures and practices that govern the organisation's conduct and sets the strategy. But it's the CEO and the executive that actually implement the strategy and the policies and procedures. So the board, if you like, is the overall supervisor and setter of policy and direction, and they must supervise and monitor performance, but they don't actually implement a company's strategy or execution of the strategy.
And just often we hear about that phrase you just mentioned, tone from the top, and the board's role, but I think you've just touched on an important point, the role of executives and management, and perhaps sometimes that's something people don't focus on enough.
Absolutely right, Tony, and it is actually the CEO and the senior leadership team, guided by the board, who actually implement day to day. And if they're not actively walking the walk and making sure that an organisation fulfils its values and its purpose, then no amount of cajoling from the board will get the right result.
And just for the board to get the right result, what sort of levers does a board have at its disposal?
Well, obviously the vision and values, the purpose of the corporation is set by the board. The board sets the strategy, and the board sets the key policies. For example, remuneration, behavioural policies, etc. And it must monitor and supervise those policies, ensure accountability for those policies. But at the end of the day, as I've said before, it's the supervisor, not the executor.
Just often in the discussion about culture, you get a sense from some people that culture is a very uniform thing, that there's a good culture and this is it. In your experience, is it that easy? Is culture the same across organisations? Does it vary? How do you see it?
It can vary significantly, even within the one organisation. You can and frequently do have subcultures, particularly in large, complex financial services or other organisations. There was a great article written by your former partner and former CEO of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, John Colvin, that made this point very powerfully, that culture, while it's critical and a key driver, is a slightly slippery concept and does vary even within the one organisation.
And just boards aren't the only people talking about culture. Regulators are talking a lot about culture at the moment as well. Do you think culture is something that can or should be regulated? Is it possible for regulators to say that's a good culture, that's a bad culture?
I don't think regulators can or even should regulate culture in a strict sense, because it's as I say, a principle. It's a slightly nebulous concept, even though it's got real live applications. So I don't think they should be regulating culture. What they should be regulating is the consequences of good or bad culture. And if they see a series of poor conduct outcomes or poor behaviours in an organisation, then they can say to the board, well, you know, you've obviously got a cultural issue here. So I think regulators should be looking at the behaviours and at the conduct that is the outcome of culture, not trying to define or regulate culture itself.
Joss, thanks very much for your time.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Tony.